so let's just look at it real quick. First of all, I think we have good reason to believe that the Gospels are written really early and not late like David said. Really early. Let me give you how I work backwards from this, okay? They like us to believe, David like us to believe, that the Gospel writers are pretty close. They're out here somewhere. They're not anywhere near. But we know if we move the Gospel writers, the closer we move the Gospel writers to the actual point of the ministry of Jesus, the more reliable the account is, right? So if it's over here, we're pretty good. It's like a chain of custody. If the casing is right here and we can tell who the officer is who picked it up, we're Jake. Okay, that makes sense? Jake, that's a little... We're okay. Okay, so we know one thing for sure. We know that history records the temple at Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D. 70 A.D. And there's no mention of this in any of the Gospels. That in and of itself, I don't think is enough to demonstrate that the Gospels are written before 70 A.D. But think about this for a second. Jesus prophesies in the Gospels about the destruction of the temple. It seems like the best thing I would want to do is if it actually happened, as I'm the Gospel writer, slam it in there, dude. It proves Jesus' prophecy. I'd be including it to make a case for the prophecy. But there's no mention not only of the temple being destroyed, there's no mention of the siege of Jerusalem, which took place, the siege of Jerusalem, which took place for a full year before the temple was destroyed. I'm not getting used to this a little. So no mention of this either. So it kind of supports the fact there's no mention of this. But even more important than that, we don't see Paul martyred in the book of Acts. There's no mentioning of Paul's death in the book of Acts. As a matter of fact, the book of Acts is finished. Paul is alive in Rome. Now the date of Paul's martyrdom is somewhere between 64 and 67. By the way, when they say, oh, there's no evidence of any of the martyrdoms, please. Here's what I do. I've been wanting to write this for a while. I'll do a whole section on Please Convince Me on just the apostles. So seriously, I spent, I think, about $600 on every source document on how the apostles were martyred. And I've got them all sitting on one shelf. It's like ridiculous. I want to get to it someday, but it's like, that's a year's work. I'm not sure which year of my life I want to give away for it. But clearly I can say one thing. There is no, because here's the argument they make. All the records of all the martyrs all the Christian apostles being martyred, they're all Christian records. Christian history and Christian communities around the world. You can't trust that stuff. It's written by Christians. So I always say, okay, do you have one non-Christian account that demonstrates that any of these guys were not martyred? Because it seems to me if you're trying to prove the opposite in the first century, you just demonstrate it. Someone's got to be writing about these famous guys and the truth about how they died. There's not one contradictory account. The only accounts we have that describe the deaths of the apostles are all martyrdoms. So I hate that. It's hard for David, but it's true. No.
Would you know what he was talking about then? Because when I brought that up, he said that there's actually evidence that he died.
That Paul, here's the problem we have, is that sometimes the details of the death vary. And a lot of early communities would like to kind of say, it happened over here, we're important too. And we have to sort through some of that. Okay? But I'll get to the actual death of the apostles in a second. You're going to see more on that. We also know that James is martyred in 61 A.D. And this is not also in the book of Acts either. So it's just interesting. I want you to also see this. We think that Luke, I would say that because of this, I would put Luke right around 60. If it's me. Because I don't see anything in the books, in Luke's work, that has these elements. So I think we can put them right here. And I think that's a fair assessment for a couple of reasons. But remember that Luke writes the gospel before he writes Acts. And we know that because when you look at the first page of Acts, it says that in my former book, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. So we know that in his former book, before he wrote Acts, he wrote the Gospels. So I placed him over here earlier. How much earlier? Well, if you want to be conservative, well, 59, if you're not happy with 53. But you're going to be in the 50s. Now, what's interesting also is that I see that Paul, when writing to Timothy in 1 Timothy, some atheists don't want to believe this is from Paul, Timothy, but they do believe 1 Corinthians is from Paul. We'll get there in a minute. But you'll see that Paul is going to say here, look, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are well or worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. The Scripture says two things. One quote from Deuteronomy, Old Testament, and the bottom quote, that's from the work of Luke. That's from Luke 10:6. He's quoting Luke as Scripture. So Paul, who we date this at 63, 64, it's consistent that somehow Luke's work is already in existence. Paul's quoting it as Scripture as if his readers would know it's Scripture. It's already going around a bit. So I think there's good evidence that this is an earlier dating for Luke. But it's worse than that. Look at this passage from 1 Corinthians. I don't see anybody else do this, but kind of my forensic statement analysis of these documents. This struck me right away. Look, this is the description of the Lord's Supper offered by Paul. What struck me about it is that he says to do this in remembrance of me. And I thought, what other account has that expression? Because a lot of accounts of the Lord's Supper, but only one the gospel writer says that Jesus said to do it in remembrance of me. You know who it was? Luke. And he says it in Luke 22. As a matter of fact, that entire passage from Paul is word for word from Luke. Clearly, Luke's gospel is already in existence. And Paul quotes it twice to people and calls it out as Scripture. I think there's a very good reason to think this is where we're dating Luke. Remember, Luke gets his stuff. Here he comes. He's getting bigger on you. He says that he didn't see this stuff. He's a historian. He calls himself out as a historian. It shouldn't surprise anybody. He's a historian. He says he's a historian. And he's doing research with the eyewitnesses and a lot of Mark's gospel. I do agree with the priority of Mark. I believe Mark is before Luke. I think he's earlier than this date because of that. So where do you want to put him? You put him where you want. He's earlier than this date, so I put him here. That's pretty darn close. What's important about this is it's hard for Mark to lie about events in which living eyewitnesses still exist to call him a liar. That's really important. And that's why I think in 1 Corinthians, written around 53, 57, no atheist doubts this date, no atheist doubts this authorship. Right here in this other, Paul says, hey, there are people out there, 500 brethren who saw the same thing. And he can do it comfortably because he's writing early. We know he's writing early because he's quoting Luke. We saw that a little while ago, right? And that date was early.